Cool. Should be recording. Just to update, we are talking about the Kent State shooting. We watched these two videos, a primary source and a secondary source, and now they're discussing. So we're going to come back together as well and go through the rest of the lesson.
You guys were passing out. Yeah, I would see I'm there. Like, I'm not going to say that. It's 195 or 6 today.
Okay, I'm going to bring you all back together real quick for this discussion. So, what I want to know is, I'm going to have you do the writing on the board in a moment, but I want you to discuss as a group, what are some like feelings you had like right away, discuss with your group after seeing this, and kind of like if you see any connections to the world today from the Kent State shooting. So discuss about that. Then send someone up from your group to write on the board a thought. That's good. Okay. Did everyone write up here who wanted to write up here? Okay. I'm going to bring us all back together. And what I really want, I'll read some of these out loud. If you wrote them down, please do be willing to like share if your table did to elaborate. You're not forced to. I'm not going to single you out. But I think some of these bring up really important points that like the videos kind of touched on in different perspectives. So we have up here, I'm going to start over here. It's disappointing because the government turned on people in Kent. Does anyone want to elaborate on that? I think what I really take away from like this point right here is the fact that, you know, they're bringing up it's disappointing that the government is turning against its own citizens. Like the US government sent in National Guard, was like, hey, you know, and allowing for this to occur where they're ultimately killing their own civilians. So it's just, and it's also wild to see that for the first time, we're seeing actual violence, or not the first time, but actual violence happening at home during the Vietnam War, because we're so divided as a country on how to feel about this, that people are willing to protest, fight for it. This one right here, we were shocked because the news tried to cover it up or make excuses. Does anyone want to elaborate on that? It doesn't have to be your group, just if you have a thought. How do you feel like the news tried to cover it up or make excuses?
Oh, but they fired first, guys. They fired first. It wasn't the government's fault. They fired first.
So your perspective is, Vivian, that the news is like, well, it's okay that violence broke out because the protesters like did something first violently.
Well, literally every single protester they asked was like, no, that didn't happen. They fired, the government fired first.
I see. Yes, about the like shooting, like the military had said, hey, we heard snipers, but then every other bystander was like, no, we didn't. Absolutely. Yeah, this like kind of like this narrative being like changed in different ways.
They don't have a reason to lie.
I see. But yes, no, I hear you, Vivian. Bailey, did you have something you wanted to add?
Not really.
Oh. Well, I think I'll move on to the next point then. I think that's a really good perspective. We found it very ridiculous and unsettling. Absolutely. Yeah, Ahmed?
I think people dying just because they disagree with an idea is like ridiculous. And
yeah,
like as a nation that defends
human rights as like as a leader is, it's not appropriate.
Like, it was just very like, it was like, we don't do that, especially, midst.
Right, yeah, that like unsettling feeling, like as a country who like represents democracy and diverse opinions. How can we resort to ultimately in this scenario looking like, murdering individuals to just disagree on a situation? Absolutely, I think you would. Yeah, against the freedom of speech. And I think that kind of connects to this point up here. I see like violence versus violence. We saw like in that video, or in both of them, they had explained that like there was violence on both sides. Does anyone kind of have like an input or a perspective on kind of like how they feel seeing that, they had said in the one video that protesters had burned down one of the buildings. But then on the, we also heard that like the military then had shot when they thought they were being shot at, when there wasn't any like witness accounts of that. And that also like the military ended up shooting, or the National Guard ended up shooting against students who were protesting.
This is like a holiday. Also,
Yeah.
Not justifying it, but I know police do that a lot, where they'll think they hear something and just react before it's thinking through it. But that doesn't make it right. No, it doesn't, I'm just saying that might have been what happened.
I see what you're both saying. So you're saying like it might have been an instantaneous reaction, like they were scared, adrenaline was pumping,
Yeah.
but then also that brings up the question.
This is why, a big reason I have, but like,
Yeah,
that they react, so. Thinking.
absolutely. There's like this moment that like sometimes, your mind can be warped with like what you hear when there's so much commotion. And then like to Lila's point, like, does that justify like the situation and what happened still? This is a very like difficult, situation to be in. And it's also interesting to think about just like how that's even still present today. I see with this point, it reminds us of the George Floyd protests. So like the Black Lives Matter movement, and a lot of those protests that were going on, especially in 2020. Does anyone want to elaborate on that?
How?
No? Oh, how? I mean, I just didn't know for sure, wait, how it like connects to those.
I mean, like, I get it, but like, I've heard it does like protest, like, do they have like, what's like, these like, thing like get back?
Yeah, I mean, there were some protests. I mean, there were protests all around the nation.
Did anyone die?
There were times where like, I mean, I don't know if your group wants to say this, but there were definitely times where like, there was stuff on the news talking about like protesters being tear gassed or being like, unnecessary force being used against protesters. But then there were times where there was violence going on. So there was like this back and forth.
I just looked it up, it said. 2 days, 2020, at least 19 people died during the protest.
You said and where did you get that? Oh, okay. But
Let me see, we find a better.
that's okay. But you're also saying, so like, it sounds like there's been over a dozen people who had,
The New York
Died.
Times said that this article 2021, at least 6 people have been killed through violence connected to the protest.
so there's still some like protests for the Black Lives Matter movement that protesters were injured or killed.
Yes.
Absolutely, yeah. Are there any other types of protests you guys can think about that like even connect to this? Yeah, Misha?
It kind of reminds me of, well, I can't remember specifics, but it's like where 4 people were arrested in Johnson County at like an LGBTQ protest. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that. It wasn't like nearly as violent, but they were definitely like, people were hurt, they were arrested. I know one of the people that were arrested, and it shocked because like, they weren't really doing anything bad, but it's like just met with violence, met with like harm, and it just sucked.
I see. So
It showed up because it's for him, but it's like,
another example where like a peaceful protest, then they're met with like law enforcement that are using like another means. Yeah, absolutely. I think like a big one that like I'll emphasize really quick, just as like a college student in today's world, Israel-Palestine protests. You've heard about like for colleges especially. They even touched on that in the first video with the guy. He said, "Oh, my son is at one of the University of California schools, and they had been met with like tear gas by law enforcement and whatnot for protesting." So I think that's another real world connection we see today. This is a constant thing that kind of keeps happening, it sounds like you all say. I see right up here, this last point I'll emphasize and then I'll move on. It was Thank you. Okay. It was very unsettling and sad because the victims were young. Also, the fact that these were 19 and 20-year-olds, definitely a very upsetting and unsettling thing that, you know, these are the prime age of people who are usually being drafted to go to war. And now they're being killed at home rather than killed abroad. It can be a very emotional moment. I could see a lot of you were very captivated by the videos. So thank you all for for participating in that. I'm going to do this, and then you have the rest of the time to start on your activity. Counterculture. The definition of counterculture. This is what like Kent State is an example of. Counterculture is a movement that strays away from like society's expectations. So like the expectation of society at this time was like, we support the Vietnam War. And the counterculture was against that. They said, hey, we don't want that. So there were protests occurring all over the country. Kent State was one example. We talked about like draft dodgers on the first day. People who are trying to avoid the draft who get drafted. Also, something we'll talk about tomorrow specifically is hippie culture and like Woodstock, if you've heard of that. And so hippie culture was a big part of this, like believing in peace and love, that kind of idea of like when we talk about hawks versus doves, kind of a more dove mindset, very peaceful, working to collaborate.
Great, so it was basically like protesting against.
Protesting against, well, like hippie culture would sometimes be associated with like drug use, but they weren't against. Counterculture specifically is a movement that strays away from society's expectation. So like the expectation at the time was supporting the Vietnam War. And so counterculture is against supporting the Vietnam. They're against the, yeah. We said the widespread use of music, that's what your activity is doing, is like analyzing different songs from this time. They were very popular. Vietnam had such a huge impact on the pop culture. And then lastly, it was a very polarizing time for the country. Very polarizing. If you couldn't tell, like, they even said in the video at the very end, they were like, hey, Kent State made it even more divided. Like, you felt strongly one way or another, like whether it was okay to support the war or whether it was bad to support the war. Does anyone have any questions on counterculture or Kent State? I'm going to give you the rest of the time to work on your assignment. You're welcome to use your headphones today and tomorrow when we work on this. Try to get through like a song or two. You got like 10 minutes. And then, yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Thank you all. Yeah,